David brought the gold shields of Hadadezer's officers to Jerusalem, along with a large amount of bronze from Hadadezer's town of Tebah and Kun. Later, Solomon melted the bronze and molded it into the great bronze basin called the sea, the pillars, and the various bronze articles used at the temple. See, now we're also getting into how even just these things that were gained from all these victories helped with giving them the supplies that were then needed to build the temple. So, it's not even just the peace that's being established, it's also the resources that are being gathered. What's up, cool people? My name's Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alright, 1 Chronicles chapter 18 is what we got next. So, the past few chapters have been focused on David, and really, pretty much every chapter has in some way or another emphasized David's connection with God, his emphasis on giving God glory, whether through worship, through his own praise, through, just reminding the people of what God has done for them, and even through looking back on his own standing and his own, position, how he started compared to while he was king, and just how much God has been an integral and crucial part of that. So with the point of 1st and 2nd Chronicles being, reminding the Jewish exiles of what got them into that situation, and, how they can make it better, it's only fair and proper to spend all this time emphasizing David and how much that he did it right by putting the emphasis and the focus always on God. Especially compared with the time that it spent talking about King Saul and the reason that he died and was replaced by David as king. There had been some chapters talking about all these, mighty warriors that were part of his army and all that. And I guess now we're going to read about some of the things that they did through all that military might. So here we go. 1 Chronicles chapter 18. After this, this being, I guess, in relation to the prior chapter where God made a promise with David that there would be that there would be a dynasty after him, that his son would rule and build a temple for worshiping the Lord, and there would be multiple generations after that God would firmly establish as, his kingdom, his people. So after this, David defeated and subdued the Philistines by conquering Gath and its surrounding towns. David also conquered the land of Moab, and the Moabites who were spared became David's subjects and paid him tribute money. David also destroyed the forces of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, as far as Hamath, when Hadadezer marched out to strengthen his control along the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He crippled all the chariot horses except enough for 100 chariots. It had talked a bit before about some of the warriors in David's army and just how proficient they were in combat. And now we're even adding to that this stuff about additional soldiers, other equipment, and of course, that stemming from different victories that they had. And this, all of these military victories end up being sort of the setup then for a time of peace after his rule when Solomon is king, who then, has all this, has this peaceful enough situation to focus on and dedicate all the time and effort needed for building the temple and also the king's palace, but definitely more importantly the temple that was just discussed in the prior chapter that David wanted to build, but God said, no, you're not the one to do it. So that was probably also a contributing factor into God's reasoning for not doing it then. It's like, well, it's not peaceful enough around you just yet. I'm gonna need like intense focus on making this temple when it's the proper time. I don't want whoever's building it to be distracted by other wars and things like that. And so, David with these victories is helping to establish that ability even for them to carry that out. Now, note there, meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain when talking about destroying the forces as far as Hamath. It could be that that's like the name of the place, but the meaning is uncertain. I'm not real sure there, but nothing to really sit here and scratch my head over. So, got 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers, all, as part of the defeat of this one king. That, of course, then adds to the stuff that he already had. Alright. On to verse 5. When Arameans from Damascus arrived to help King Hadadezer, David killed 22,000 of them. Then he placed several army garrisons in Damascus, the Aramean capital, and the Arameans became David's subjects and paid him tribute money. So the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. David brought the gold shields of Hadadezer's officers to Jerusalem, along with a large amount of bronze from Hadadezer's town of Tebah and Kun. Later, Solomon melted the bronze and molded it into the great bronze basin called the sea, the pillars, and the various bronze articles used at the temple. See, now we're also getting into how even just these things that were gained from all these victories helped with giving them the supplies that were then needed to build the temple. So, it's not even just the peace that's being established, it's also the resources that are being gathered. Poetically Christian says, David was going to be in constant war. Prophet Nathan told David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10, that the sword would always be against his house. So God probably left the building to Solomon because David was always going to be in the midst of conflict, as we're reading about right here. But yeah, again, I think it's not only that, but it's also like, it even says directly here that the bronze that they got from, their victory over Hadadezer, who was which king? I don't know. Anyway, a bunch of this stuff that they got that became useful for building the temple later on. And perhaps also there were some alliances established and things of that sort that then also helped with bringing in workers and other supplies that they wouldn't have gotten in battle. So, yeah, it It wasn't just a, no, this isn't happening now because I said so, because you've got too much blood on your hands, or anything like that. It's also like, okay, it's not time yet because we don't have all of the resources, and I'm giving you time to establish peace and get some of those resources from the people that you're going to conquer. Anyway, looking at chat here. Absolutely, God always has more going on than we realize. He always has an ultimate plan with all the pieces falling into place. Yeah. Okay, a couple of notes to look at here. In verse 6, when discussing the army garrisons, as in Greek version and Latin Vulgate, Hebrew lacks several army garrisons. But then what would he be placing in Damascus? Could just say he placed them, or he placed soldiers in Damascus. I don't know. But, you know, he had some representatives, or, you know, some forces there to kind of help ensure that tributes were paid, and that, you know, they didn't try to whip up any rebellion or anything like that, probably. And then note here at Tiba, Hebrew reads Tibhath, a variant spelling of Tiba. Compare the parallel text to 2 Samuel 8:8. Okay. So that might read Tiba instead of Tibhath, but anyway. So he gets all this bronze that later gets used to build stuff for the temple. They've got these gold shields now, I'm pretty sure it mentioned. Where did I mention that? Yeah, David brought the gold shields of Hadadezer's officers to Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't say yet whether they continue to be used as shields or were later melted for gold for the palace. But still, resources of some kind. Some of that, even if not used for the temple, was then later given as sort of like appeasement to other powerful kingdoms that came through and tried to wipe out Israel/Judah sooner than it was the appointed time for. We'll just put it that way. Anyway, okay, on to verse 9. When King Toi of Hamath heard that David had destroyed the entire army of King Hadadezer of Zobah, he sent his son Joram to congratulate King David for his successful campaign. Hadadezer and Toi had been enemies and were often at war. Joram presented David with many gifts of gold, silver, and bronze. King David dedicated all these gifts to the Lord, along with the silver and gold he had taken from the other nations, from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Philistia, and Amalek. See, okay, I had already kind of mentioned maybe some alliances being established here, but there weren't really any verses in this chapter related to that. Now we have some, because King Toi here was enemies with Hadadezer, so then when David defeated Hadadezer, King Toi is like, hey, thanks, you did me a real solid favor there. Here's a gift. And maybe we can continue being buddies and helping each other out here. So, yeah. Further advancements of both the peacemaking efforts and the resource gathering that has been sort of a big theme. And it's all the more relevant, I guess, reading and discussing all this right after the chapter where it mentioned that God would establish David's dynasty, and that, well, also that, you know, his son would be building the temple, and that there would be great prosperity, and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. It's like, okay, we read about God's promise, and then we're immediately the next chapter reading about how he's establishing all of that stuff and making good on it. Note there, King Toy, as in parallel text, 2 Samuel 8:9. Hebrew reads Tou. I don't know how you would pronounce that. Also in 18:10. Note there in verse 10, next to Joram, as in parallel text, 2 Samuel 8:10. Hebrew reads Hadaram, variant spelling, but still the same person, presumably, because, you know, ancient Hebrew, very different language. David isn't, like, being selfish with all these things that they're gathering. He dedicated all those gifts from Joram / King Toy, dedicated all that to the Lord, along with the silver and gold he had taken from all these other nations. So again, God is at the center. That's who he's dedicating it to. Not to himself. It's all to the Lord. Okay. On to verse 12. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, destroyed 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He placed army garrisons in Edom, and all the Edomites became David's subjects. In fact, the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel and did what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was commander of the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were the priests. Seraiah was the court secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was captain of the king's royal bodyguard. And David's sons served as the king's chief assistants. And just further establishment of what we've already been discussing. And notes on some of the people who kind of helped make it happen. And not only make it happen, but like kind of keep it organized. Note there at Ahimelech, as in some Hebrew manuscripts, Syriac version, and Latin Vulgate, most Hebrew manuscripts read Abimelech rather than Ahimelech. Pretty close, though. Hebrew says, of the Kerethites and Pelethites, rather than saying the king's bodyguard. But that's the role that the Kerethites and Pelethites had, presumably, was being the king's bodyguard. So, David is militarily successful, and not only that, but it's also setting the stage for, you know, I mean, it's talking about, you know, priests, captain of the bodyguard, so like all these important officers and positions around him were being established as well. To further emphasize the point that it's not just David being awesome, it's not just his efforts, his brilliance, his military might, or anything like that. It's all the Lord's doing. That's who he's putting the emphasis on. But he's also getting help from people around him with gathering these resources, organizing them, figuring out what to do with them, and, of course, the, you know, battles that are, you know, building peace around them, building alliances, and, like, all this stuff that's going on. It's a team effort, directed, essentially, by God and emphasizing God's provision. But that's all I got for 1 Chronicles 18. So, the evidence compiles even further for how successful the Israelites were when, God was the focus of most of what they did. In this case, it was a lot of military stuff, but also, making things more prosperous by, gathering resources from other nations that they defeated and making alliances with some others and all sorts of things like that. That, chapter 17 more so emphasized the focus on God and how well that went for David, how much of an emphasis that was for him. And then this chapter we get here's how things went for David, who was so dedicated to the Lord. If they didn't put the dots together by this point, I think it was even more hopeless than any of them felt in their exile. So, anyway, okay, lest I digress, that's going to do it for this one. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description for links to social media pages and all sorts of good stuff like that, including Discord server, where we can chat about stuff in between videos, and my supporter page, where you can sign up for a membership, get regular updates that I don't necessarily put out on all my social media, maybe even get early access to my videos, all sorts of things like that. And it'll help me out, with affording new games to play, or maybe eventually upgrading some equipment or some things like that. But anyway, down below in the description, make sure you leave your thoughts and questions in the comment section if you don't feel like engaging in any of those other ways. So that's going to do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you soon for another video, whatever the case is. Till next time, stay cool, people.